Let's talk about what's happening with inflation from a big picture standpoint. The strange reality is that most Americans haven't had to worry about inflation in several decades. But like a lot of other things recently, that was upended by the pandemic. Now, we certainly saw shortages and price spikes in food and household items during the shutdown. But it wasn't until economies reopened and consumers' pent-up demand was unleashed that the extent of the disruption to supply chains became more evident. That isn't to say that the jump in inflation was a shock, though. Economists, investors, and the Federal Reserve all expected inflation to initially push higher when economies reopened. The general consensus, however, was that the shift in inflation would prove temporary, or in what would become the new industry buzzword, transitory. As the year progressed and higher inflation not only persisted, but continued to move higher, the storyline shifted, and views on where inflation was headed increasingly diverged. Even the Federal Reserve, perhaps the first to push the transitory narrative, finally dropped the term from its most recent formal communications. So where does inflation go from here? The term transitory may have been retired, but most economists and the Fed still expect inflation to at least moderate, meaning that they expect inflation to decelerate and eventually fall back as supply chain issues abate. Opinions vary rather wildly, however, on what level inflation eventually falls back to. Those who think it will fall back to pre-pandemic levels or just above focus on the likely fading of supply chain issues, whereas those that believe higher inflation will be sticky believe that the Fed has been too slow to act and that wage pressures, partly a result of the pandemic-inspired Great Resignation, are here to stay. Only time will tell who is right, obviously, but the next few months and quarters will give us a much better picture of how things will ultimately shake out. Economist opinions are one thing, but I'm equally interested in where investors today are placing their bets or their dollars. Interestingly, this chart, which in simple terms looks at what investors think inflation will look like 5 years down the road or from the year 2027 to 2031, indicates that most still expect that inflation will eventually work its way back to the low 2% levels. There is obviously no guarantee that this chart will prove accurate, but in a news cycle where we're bombarded with extreme headlines and viewpoints, it is at least interesting to know that the majority of investors, or at least investment dollars, remain unconvinced that high inflation is here to stay. Now, the other side of a chart like we just saw is that if higher inflation does prove sticky or persistent, most investors are not really prepared or positioned for that, which leads me to our next segment. What might higher inflation mean for financial markets and investors? If you have any questions or would like to discuss your personal wealth management needs, please contact us at the email address or phone number at the close of this segment. Thank you.